It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I hope it's also going to be fun, and it's a distinct honor to be speaking after Mr. de Hoop Scheffer. Maybe let me, inspired by his story, but obviously not having the benefit of such long and outstanding experience, all protocols observed, as they say in Ghana, I was reminded of another story, and I'd like to give it to you also as sort of maybe advice or experience, an experience of how one actually can make mistakes, even when one is at a more senior level of experience. I was in Sudan until recently, a year ago, as regional director for the Middle East and North Africa, Southern Sudan, Juba. We came with the UNICEF plane and we visited the, sort of the outbacks of Sudan where very little services were available. And despite actually not having done very much, if I say so, sort of for the international community, the whole village came out to greet us, to honor us. And I was there the regional director, so even though I was the female, I was the most senior dignitary, and I was honored as such. I was therefore surrounded by the tribal elders, and I lost my delegation. And that was okay temporarily, because we were together and there was certainly not a safety issue. But I was asked to jump over a bull. And as I thought I was very properly dressed, that I was trousered, but I had a dress that didn't really allow for jumping, so I got very busy with the thought of jumping over the bull. I never thought the bull would subsequently be slaughtered the moment I jumped over the bull. And this was left for my delegates to observe. Okay, we visit one village. I was separated from my delegation, no communication with them. Second village, same story, another bull. Until that moment, I had not realized that sacrifice was the killing. It was the honor killing for the visitors, for the help UNICEF had provided. So I'd lost my delegation. So whatever you do also in this week, no matter which level of seniority or how successful you think you are, don't lose sight of your delegates. And always wonder, have I scanned the horizon? Have I observed everything that I really, really need to know? And I think today's talk about global governance, the future of multilateralism, is also very much about scanning the horizon. As Mr. de Hoop Scheffer and Minister Rosenthal have already remarked, there are a number of issues and threats and challenges. I'd like to briefly walk you through why I think the topic is so relevant, what my storyline will be, the situation to date, and really where the UN development system, or rather development actors, will fit in. We've heard a lot about the security angle, Security Council, NATO, the EU. I'd like to speak a little bit more, and I hope it will complement the other speakers, about where development issues are and what we need to do from a developmental perspective. And then also where the risks and challenges lie for the UN development system in this large setting. But after all, at the end of the day, we all are concerned with effective multilateralism. It's no longer the question whether we are or do not want to be multilateral. The whole notion of effective multilateralism is really the question to date. And I've got to go back to my glasses now a little bit to look at my note. So I think you've actually picked a topic that is not only recently debated and studied and is obviously of primary importance, it's also something that member states just in June this year at the G8 discussed. The Secretary General came to speak, and everybody gives a perspective. But all we know is that the development architecture to date has totally changed, and Mr. de Hoop Scheffer referred to it in his intervention as well. We're looking at a world where all the actors have changed, and the presumption of governance and multilateral governance as being one where governments within the UN have agreements, and therefore there will be solutions, and therefore they'll be applied, is not an assumption that has not always been proven right in the first place, but more importantly, the spectrum has changed. There's a plethora of actors, and from a development perspective, we're dealing with the transformation of the development architecture. To give you an example about the players, and all of you will know of the OECD DAC. The OECD DAC speaks primarily nowadays of the results agenda. And for those of you who live and work or study in the Netherlands, you'll know very much the term value for money. Do I, as a donor, as a bilateral donor, can I get the guarantees for the taxpayers at times of fiscal austerity? My money is well spent. Can I have a story? Can I put it on my web? Is the story of developmental transformation is very clear? As a result, we often end up looking at short-term outputs rather than transformational changes, because that is a change that takes time, is often difficult to capture. But it's an important debate. It also goes with transparency and accountability of international financing. It relates to governance in developing countries. For LDCs and the middle-income countries, the story is very much about the new development models. As we know and as we hear of Brazil's success, or China's tremendous emergence, or South Africa, or Russia's economic progress, and India, it's really about models that are out there on the development market. It is no longer a North-South debate. It is very much one of South, talking to South, China offering solutions in Africa, with a different conditionality, we think, but a Brazil that is looking to work in Africa and is actually trying to triangulate. So it's no longer what the OECD has to offer only to the South. It is really a world where you have a marketplace and countries and individuals are searching for solutions. In this setting, multilateralism has also changed. We see a lot of solutions what has been called a mini-lateralism. So it is beyond the UN, it is actually a smaller grouping of countries and actors. And Gavi is one entity. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Global Alliance of Vaccine Initiative, which actually is joined by countries, the UK, I believe the Netherlands and a few other big donors, but also by Bill Gates. And they have coalesced. They decided that immunization and vaccines were the most important issue to solve when they set it up. And you have an entity. And the power and the convening power of an entity such as Gavi is not only minilateral, but it's also highly effective. It actually influences policies, it changes market prices for drugs. And that's just one example. The other obvious example which was mentioned earlier is of course the G20. It's a group that has been around for quite a while, we all forgot about it, but it came into resurgence over the financial crisis. So these are examples where you can leverage, you can influence, and you can set the pace. But it doesn't always have the universal convening power and the legitimacy the United Nations system has. But I'll come back to that. But the role of minilateralist approaches is very important, and they're often very critical crisis management mechanisms. With that, of course, if you look at the plethora of actors, and I've just mentioned them, are the emerging powers, but we should also not forget the foundations, the large NGOs, civil society organizations, all using new tools. At the moment, the way I see it, and if you look a decade out, we're living almost in an individual choice and response to engagement in multilateral fora. It is primarily how if I want to participate, I can do it on eBay, I can have a foundation, I can convene through social media. I don't have to wait to be a formal delegate to anyone's national delegation to be at the UN. My voice can be heard in many, many different ways. So in this, the development discussions that take place are very much in this setting where a lot of players are out there, they have a voice, they use it, and rightly so, and they hold all of us collectively accountable. It also means that the scope and the scale of action has changed. If you have a good idea, if you've got proof of concept, and if you can accelerate it, or if you can offer it as a model for application, you can be influential. The downside of the current trends that we see in the context in which we operate is that a number of the traditional donor countries are very much bilateralizing their multilateral engagement. We see that in the development sphere more perhaps than in other fora. To give you an example, if I'm a donor, I prefer to give to crisis prevention and recovery. And yet I will not necessarily finance the core system of the organization that I also believe has a relevant role. In doing so, I am de facto changing the mandate and the ability of that organization to perform against its broader remit. And this is very much a discussion. At the same time, the options and choices that we have and the opportunities to engage with a Mexico, with an India and a China as international actors with a very new role is significant. It has implications, however, though, particularly for the UN development system. Now, if you look at what we can do when you look at multilateral governance in a development setting, I've tried to look at it also from a perspective of risks and challenges, and the challenges also as they apply to our system. Because at the end of the day, we're dealing with what is called problems without passports. I think a number of them are named this morning, but we have a number of others, and I think they're quite known. I'm not inventing or reinventing the wheel here, but at the end of the day, it needs multilateral and sub-multilateral responses. But what are the challenges, from my perspective, for which continued multilateral engagement is needed? The obvious ones: food, fuel, and financial crisis. The impact of these crises is with the developing countries to date. The same way as the developed world is paying a price and recovery is expected to be slow. But high and volatile food and fuel prices represent an increasingly large portion of household income of the developing world. It basically also threatens further progress in the middle-income countries. So those who were on the up risk a further downfall with significant impact. Migration, and I would tie that to employment and employability. I don't see, let me be very clear, I don't speak from a Fortress Europe perspective. Migration as such is not a challenge. It is the way it is managed, the way opportunities are created. And this is where the absence of employment, the absence of employable skills is a tremendous issue. And I think all of us by now, for all of us who've just followed even marginally the impact of the Arab Spring, all of you will have heard the notion of the youth bulge, as it was described, the absence of skill sets that are relevant for today's labour market. and the sheer population dynamic. But it's not only Middle East and North Africa, it is in Latin America, it is in Africa itself. A number of you will have seen that rise that took place in Uganda and other countries. It is all about my opportunity as a youngster to thrive, my opportunity to find a job and to establish my family, to exercise my choice and not only be confined to the traditional family setting and also be able to actually use my skill set. To give another example why migration, population growth and urban settings is a real challenge, and particularly the rate of urbanization. As governments, and I think as all of us working in international development to find solutions, policy solutions, we are not yet equipped to deal with the rate of urbanization. We're dealing with such a scope of cities that no single municipality or government or subnational government is equipped to deal. It is not only services or supply, but it's also creating access. And traditional development models have always looked at the rural areas as the ones most disadvantaged and the ones most in need. What we're finding out now is that the same pockets of deprivation and inequity find themselves in the megapoles of this world. At the rate of population growth and the absence of employment in the rural areas is only pushing this tendency to go further. And we've seen in Latin America, and I'll have to reconfirm my statistics, but in Latin America at the moment, due to the absence of employment, the death rate due to gang wars and just sheer violence in the inner cities amongst youngsters is higher than the death rate following terrorist attacks in a country such as Afghanistan. The optics may sound almost contradictory, but it shows there are silent crises that will come to the fore in such a way that we will not have the coping mechanisms, hence the challenge. Climate change is a very obvious one, and I think we live and breathe it, we monitor it, we all, I think, are concerned about the success of Rio+20. But again, the poorest countries will suffer more. The impact of drought, the impact on water supplies, the opportunity to actually engage in meaningful, sustainable human development, which also means building a green economy in the poorest countries, is significant. If we fail, however, to find solutions, agreed solutions, on the ways to tackle climate change, obviously we will let these countries down. Conflict and fragility, I would also include their political transitions and obviously that need a spiral processes, but here again I think we have an interesting statistics. At the moment we have 75 countries that are identified as facing violent tensions, and 22 of the 34 of these countries are the furthest from reaching the Millennium Development Goals. You will recall from the summit last year in September, there was a lot of excitement because the MDG story is also one of success. It is not only about meeting the targets and the goals and showing where we are off track, but we've made a lot of measurable and demonstrable progress. But the highest risk, again, are the countries that are either subject to tensions or are in current crisis and or are called fragile states. Within that, of course, we have a tremendous responsibility to help and assist and work where actually we are often not wanted. And if I may just draw one example from the Middle East and North Africa, the UN there for a long time now has been confused, the UN funds and programs, including humanitarian actors, we have become confused with Security Council decisions. Hence we are no longer seen to be neutral actors. Actually we are seen to be part of the problem, we are seen to have chosen sides, so to speak, and this is not obviously my judgment, it is a perception. If you do perception surveys in any of these countries, the UN stands for status quo of a certain political arrangement at this point in time. We are not neutral and impartial, not in the eyes of those whom we seek to serve. Hence we often also end up as collateral damage. When I was regional director and I first took my assignment, and I've spent 20 years in and out of the Middle East, so I was delighted to go, thinking that I would be a part of a strategic debate again. I found myself just after the Algeria bombing, when the UN lost 20 staff members in a terrorist attack, I found myself being a mix of an estate agent, a real estate agent, trying to fortify all our buildings to the point that actually anybody who would want to have a meeting with us would be going through the sandbags, past the security officers. And the second role I had was basically regional security officer. I was continuously worried about the loss of lives and whether we had done enough to save people. And these were UN staff. When I joined the UN, it would never have been conceivable that a UN staff member would have to worry because they were seen to be a legitimate target by extremist groups. And this is the context in which we live. Now this is a UN-specific security matter, but it's important when you look at changing lives, transforming, rendering service, when you're working in an environment where you're seen to be less than neutral. Now when you look at future scenarios and risks, and I'd like to quote just from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Survey, It shows two high-risk factors in all of this. So we know the challenges, but economic disparity and global governance failures are the two most highly connected risks. And within that, of course, we're looking at financial stability, climate stability, and trade. What are the 5 biggest risks? And I refer, for those of you who haven't read it yet, it's an interesting book by Uri Tadeusz about risks and the future, and it's called The Juggernauts. The risk of inadequate economic progress, I think that's obvious. The risk of sustained financial crisis, the risk of over-exploitation of climate resources and what that would imply, but also the risk of collective inaction. And this again is where multilateral governance comes in. Very often we are very good at describing the situation, and I confess I'm probably guilty of that as well as I stand here now. We describe, but we're not active enough in pushing the envelope and forging a change in the situation. Because description at the end of the day is easier, it avoids taking responsibility, it also avoids an accountability. So, and I think this is also where it's interesting for practitioners such as myself, and I hope that Mr. de Hoogscheffer agrees. It's also interesting at the end of the week to hear your views. What you see can be the breakthrough. What will be the trigger for a set of positive changes that could actually benefit the system writ large? Now, if you look at credible multilateral solutions for all these challenges, obviously we need to look at the role and form multilateralism and multilateral governance can take to date. I would like to make 5 observations there. One of them is that maybe the rules of the game have changed, but we don't really benefit from sort of pretending as if we could design a multilateral system from scratch. There are design errors, there are changes. Obviously, when you're looking at inclusiveness, when you're looking at the voice of the Global South, not only in the Security Council, but also within ECOSOC, when you're looking at the different funds and programs, from UNDP to UNICEF, WFP, the debate has to change. Our decision-making optic has to be much more inclusive and looking at situations from a more balanced perspective where we can. Ensuring policy coherence. It's often a debate, I know, also in Brussels and elsewhere, and we face that on the receiving end when you're in a fund and a program. You meet the same government officials, and everybody will tell you something else, because some of them have the Ministry of Finance optic, which basically is the Washington IMF perspective. You come to talk on the same issue to a UNDP, you get different guidance. And when you go to an ECOSOC, we hear another voice. Policy coherence is critical. It's extremely difficult to achieve, but it is fundamental to make sure we optimize the use of resources, we send clear messages, and we actually help set priorities and carry them through. I think often our inaction or lack of results on the ground, be it in developing countries or in global fora, is not because our intentions or our analysis isn't correct, it's because we fail to connect the dots at the moment where it matters the most. And it's easier said than done, but at the end of the day, we can always improve. Now, the convening power that I think particularly the UN continues to offer, based on its legitimacy and based on its all-encompassing, value-based, not only rules-based, but value-based and rights-based platform is critical. And as we're looking at a world which is changing, it is also our responsibility, and I say that particularly as a UN official, to look at the new actors where their voices are, to not let go of our value system. It is too easy to engage with new partners and conclude we can collaborate in this region, in that area, we can work on climate change, without coming back to what makes the UN system the way it is. It is rights-based, the human rights anchor, it is looking at the Millennium Declaration, not only at the goals, because Einstein seems to be a popular figure also today. Einstein apparently is supposed to have said, you can hit the target but miss the point. And you can do a fantastic job but miss the point if you don't push for rights, if you don't push for transformation, if you don't push for democratic governance. It may take time. We have to work within social and cultural values. We have to be very cognizant and respectful of national ownership. At the end of the day, without national ownership, not necessarily equated to be government ownership. That is the lesson we all learned the hard way, I think, in the Middle East and North Africa. We always said, oh, we have government support. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean you've reached out to society writ large. But national ownership, fully and inclusive, is a way forward. And it has to be a two-way street, the dialogue. And some of you may be aware or may have in your preparations also looked at the high-level forum for aid effectiveness in Busan later this year, in November, where we have a critical political moment of dialogue between all member states, but particularly the emerging economies, on aid effectiveness. We're all trying to push the discussion to move from aid effectiveness, which is in a way a traditional dialogue, to development effectiveness. What will it take? What will it mean? But it's not only about resources, it is about much more than that. And actually, if you look at the statistics, the aid and development environment in which we operate is not lacking resources. But resources are channeled in very many different ways. So we also have to rethink how we can leverage the availability of financial flows and expertise to actually have the biggest bang for the buck. At the end of the day, that means careful planning and a critical analysis. Now, the shopping for development models, as I said, and we call it sometimes shopping because it's almost a marketplace where you really look what worked for my neighbor, can I apply it? So it's a move away from the very traditional one-way street that maybe has dominated development discussion in the 60s and the 70s. Now, the voice and representation of all stakeholders I mentioned, but it really means that we need to look for a new consensus on what development is, where we can take it, looking at the challenges we've identified, and can we be ready in 2025 so we don't have any regrets. We know climate change is an issue, we know the food and financial crisis is an issue, and we know the biggest opportunity we cannot miss is employment. Employment creation, where the role of the private sector can play a critical role in fostering inclusive growth. And inclusive is really the term, because we're also looking at equity and we're looking at opportunities, male-female, the gender balance is an important one. So what are the changes required when you're looking at the UN development system to actually ensure relevance? We're not living easy times at the moment for a lot of the funds and programs. We are criticized by Western donors, or rather constructively criticizing questions, and rightly so. We're asking, what are the results you deliver? Do you provide value for money, as I mentioned from the outset? And can we actually do a better job without you? It's a legitimate question, so the question is up to us also to prove that through the UN you can actually reach more in an efficient and an effective way and in an impartial manner, and that we actually are there on the ground working with communities as well as with governments and other partners before, during and after a crisis, but throughout the development journey that a lot of countries undergo. I would also argue at a time when actually governments are looking to work more efficiently, you can multiply your impact through multilateral action rather than replicate bilaterally. But that is obviously something for politicians. The second one is that the UN system itself needs to undertake a number of reforms. That means both the way we manage our resources, if we have the right profile of staff, and if we're actually fit for purpose. Are we flexible and agile? A number of our partners question us increasingly, and they tell us, you're too slow, we'd like to work with you, but the cost of doing business, the transaction cost of doing business with you is so high that actually I could do it better in a different way. So these are very important lessons. Last but not least, of course, is the political context, particularly ECOSOC and other fora in which we operate. And we have a responsibility there as well to actually influence our member states. But again, it's a two-way process. The UN development system at the end of the day is also still run by the member states and its delegations, so we need to make sure that the dialogue is not only open, but is also focused and is action-oriented. And I think when you replicate this week, I would very much invite you to obviously not replicate the protracted marathons which really produce the resolution of the lowest common denominator, which don't really do us any proud. Higher ideal, and you walk the talk. And this is also obviously where we always pay tremendous homage to our colleagues who lost their lives in the exercise of their duty. And this is obviously beyond any sacrifice anybody should be asked to make, and no one is. But the areas of competence of the UN are areas we need to strengthen. It is sustainable development, linked to human rights, and the nexus peace and security. This is unique. All other actors have a complementary and sometimes much stronger role to play. But the convening platform that needs to be organized and I think strengthened through investments and political support is one where obviously we can truly and honestly say we're all multilateralists, because at the end of the day, you don't need to work for the UN to be committed to multilateralism. I like to think that my children, who range from 8 to 16 and have 4, they're all multilateral in their own little way. Maybe as citizens of the future, maybe as journalists, maybe as activists, maybe in the way they vote, or they decide to have their taxpayers' money spent. One way or another, we can all individually make a difference by making the right choices. And I really like to see that you're obviously the future leaders. And I commend you for your tremendous vision and your inspiration, because it's certainly always very meaningful to people like me. It also makes us feel that there's hope that the next generation is thinking about the future and is committed to do it together in a truly multilateral fashion. Thank you very much.